Hey guys, tonight we're travelling to ancient Egypt to meet perhaps the most misunderstood woman in history, Cleopatra. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you were asked to describe Cleopatra using only one word, there's a good chance that word would be beautiful. Not queen, not scholar, not polyglot, not one of antiquity's most capable political survivors. Just beautiful. For more than 2,000 years, Cleopatra has been introduced as history's ultimate femme fatale, a woman so breathtakingly attractive that the most powerful men in Rome supposedly forgot how to govern the largest republic on earth the moment she smiled in their direction. According to popular culture, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, conquered Gaul, survived countless battles, and outmaneuvered every rival imaginable. But one look at Cleopatra, and suddenly his strategic thinking packed its bags and went on holiday. It's a wonderfully dramatic story. It also gives Roman politicians remarkably little credit. They may have been ambitious, ruthless, and occasionally willing to start a civil war over a disagreement, but they generally weren't complete idiots. The Cleopatra, most people imagine today, is actually the product of centuries of imagination. Renaissance painters gave her the face of an Italian noblewoman. Victorian artists somehow made her look like she'd just stepped out of a luxury perfume advertisement. Hollywood, naturally, recruited some of the most beautiful actresses in the world to play her. At that point, the historical Cleopatra never really stood a chance. After enough paintings, plays, novels, television shows, documentaries, and blockbuster films, the legend became stronger than the evidence. The funny part is that the ancient writers, the people closest to Cleopatra's lifetime, don't spend nearly as much time admiring her looks as modern audiences do. One of our most valuable sources is the Greek historian Plutarch, writing roughly a century after Cleopatra's death. If anyone had the perfect opportunity to tell readers she was unimaginably beautiful, it was him. Instead, he basically says, not exactly. Plutarch explains that her beauty was not incomparable or immediately astonishing. That sentence has probably disappointed generations of Hollywood casting directors. Rather than describing a woman whose appearance alone overwhelmed everyone around her, Plutarch says her real power came from something much harder to paint on a canvas. Her conversation, her intelligence, her confidence, the charm in her voice, the way she spoke, the way she made people feel when they were around her. In other words, Cleopatra mastered what today we'd probably call charisma. And unlike expensive jewellery, charisma unfortunately cannot be displayed in a museum glass case with a helpful little information plaque. Imagine attending a dinner party where one guest quietly becomes the centre of every conversation. They aren't necessarily the most attractive person in the room, yet somehow everyone gradually turns toward them. They remember names. They ask clever questions. They know exactly when to make a joke, when to flatter someone, and when to simply listen. Hours later, that's the person everyone remembers. That appears to have been Cleopatra. She spoke numerous languages fluently, allowing her to communicate directly with foreign rulers and ambassadors without interpreters. In the ancient world, this was surprisingly unusual. Most monarchs relied on translators, which is an excellent way to accidentally declare war, because someone misunderstood the word for tribute. Cleopatra preferred avoiding those sorts of misunderstandings. She studied philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, economics, rhetoric, and literature in Alexandria, home to the greatest library in the ancient world. While other royal children were learning how to sit elegantly during ceremonies, Cleopatra was busy learning how kingdoms actually functioned. That turned out to be the far more useful hobby. Yet somewhere along the way, those accomplishments were quietly pushed into the background. The main reason was politics. After Cleopatra's death, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, needed to justify why Rome had fought one final civil war. Saying, "I defeated an exceptionally intelligent foreign queen who nearly outplayed us all," wasn't nearly as convenient as saying, "Rome was rescued from a dangerous seductress who bewitched honourable Roman men." It was brilliant propaganda, and like much successful propaganda, people kept repeating it long after everyone involved had died. Poets embraced it, playwrights expanded it, painters embroidered it, Hollywood wrapped it in gold jewellery, dramatic music, and enough eyeliner to empty an entire cosmetics store. By then, the myth had become almost impossible to separate from the woman. So tonight, we're going to attempt something rather unusual. We're going to meet Cleopatra before 2,000 years of storytelling gave her the world's most famous makeover. Because the real Cleopatra wasn't extraordinary simply because she may have been attractive. She was extraordinary because she ruled one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean while surrounded by assassins, rival siblings, ambitious Roman generals, collapsing alliances, and enough political backstabbing to make a porcupine feel uncomfortable. And somehow, against all reasonable expectations, she kept winning. Before Cleopatra ever met Julius Caesar, before she sailed up the Nile with Mark Antony, and long before Roman propaganda transformed her into history's most famous temptress, she had already survived something most people would politely decline: her own family. Now every family has disagreements. Some argue about money, others argue about politics. A few brave souls even argue over who forgot to buy bread. The Ptolemies, however, preferred a more direct approach. They argued with poison, or armies, or the occasional assassination. To understand Cleopatra, you first have to understand the remarkable collection of relatives she inherited. Her family belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded nearly 3 centuries earlier by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. When Alexander died in 323 before Christ without a clear adult heir, his empire immediately fell apart. His generals divided the territories between themselves, and Ptolemy claimed Egypt. It was an excellent choice. Egypt possessed fertile farmland, immense wealth, busy trade routes, and the dependable Nile River, which politely arrived every year with fresh water instead of unpleasant surprises. Compared with many neighbouring kingdoms, it was practically ancient real estate with waterfront views. The Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria, a city that quickly became one of the greatest centres of learning in the ancient world. They spoke Greek, governed like Macedonian monarchs, and proudly traced their ancestry back to Alexander's companions. Interestingly, despite ruling Egypt for generations, they rarely bothered learning the Egyptian language. That would eventually make Cleopatra rather unusual. But the dynasty also developed another tradition, one that modern family therapists would probably describe as deeply concerning. To preserve what they believed was the purity of the royal bloodline, brothers frequently married sisters, uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins. Family trees began looking less like trees and more like circles that had simply given up trying. These marriages weren't based on romance. They were political arrangements designed to keep power concentrated within the royal household. Unfortunately, they also concentrated something else: rivalry. Every royal child grew up knowing that brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers, uncles, and cousins could all become competitors for the throne. Trust was a luxury very few could afford. Cleopatra herself was born around 69 before Christ, the daughter of King Ptolemy XII, a ruler whose greatest talent seemed to be paying Rome enormous amounts of money in exchange for staying king a little longer. Roman politicians happily accepted these payments, proving once again that accepting other people's money is an ancient profession. When Cleopatra was still young, her father was driven from Egypt by a popular uprising. For several years he lived in exile under Roman protection while trying to convince influential senators to restore him to power. Eventually, they did, not out of kindness, of course. There was considerable profit to be made. Watching all of this unfold taught Cleopatra an unforgettable lesson before she was even an adult. power was rarely inherited safely. It had to be negotiated, purchased, defended, and, when necessary, fought for. By the time she reached adulthood, she had learned something few princesses ever wished to master. In her family, surviving was often a greater achievement than simply being born royal. While most royal children spent their youth learning how to smile politely during ceremonies and avoid spilling wine on expensive robes, Cleopatra was preparing for a very different future. She was preparing to rule. That may sound perfectly normal for a princess. After all, royal families usually educate their children to become future monarchs. The Ptolemies, however, had a slightly different educational philosophy. They educated all their children because no one knew which one would still be alive in 10 years. Growing up in Alexandria offered Cleopatra an advantage that few rulers in history ever enjoyed. She lived in one of the greatest intellectual capitals the world had ever seen. Founded by Alexander the Great and expanded under the Ptolemies, Alexandria wasn't simply another large city. It was the Silicon Valley, Oxford, and New York of the ancient Mediterranean rolled into one, except with considerably more marble and significantly fewer coffee shops. Scholars travelled from Greece, Egypt, Persia, India, and beyond to exchange ideas. Ships entering the harbour often had their books copied for the famous Library of Alexandria before they were allowed to continue their journeys. Imagine arriving at customs today and being told, "Thank you for visiting. We'll just borrow your laptop for a few weeks." The library itself became legendary, containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls covering nearly every subject imaginable. Philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, geography, engineering, poetry, and history all found a home within its walls. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by that world. Although historians cannot list every lesson she received, the ancient sources consistently describe her as exceptionally well educated. She studied rhetoric, allowing her to persuade audiences with carefully chosen words. She learned philosophy, which taught rulers how to reason through difficult decisions rather than simply reacting to them. Mathematics and astronomy helped her understand taxation, calendars, navigation, and agriculture. Medicine fascinated her enough that later writers claimed she conducted research into herbs and remedies, though some stories are undoubtedly exaggerated. She also became an accomplished reader of literature and history. That mattered more than it might seem. History, after all, was the instruction manual for surviving politics. Every successful ruler before her became another case study. Every failed ruler became a warning. Unlike modern students, Cleopatra couldn't simply search "How not to lose your kingdom" and receive a helpful list of articles. She had to read several centuries of expensive scrolls instead. One subject, however, became her greatest strength: languages. Most members of the Ptolemaic dynasty spoke Greek and relied heavily on interpreters whenever they dealt with foreign peoples. Cleopatra took a different approach entirely. According to ancient writers, she spoke numerous languages fluently. Greek remained her native tongue, but she also learned Egyptian, the language previous Ptolemaic rulers had largely ignored, as well as several neighbouring languages used by diplomats and merchants throughout the eastern Mediterranean. This gave her a remarkable advantage. She could greet ambassadors in their own language. She could negotiate directly without waiting for translators. She could hear subtle changes in tone, hesitation, or confidence that often disappeared during interpretation. Anyone who has watched an awkward conversation slowly unravel through 3 different translators can appreciate how valuable that was. Words carry more than meaning. They carry emotion. They build trust. Cleopatra understood that better than almost anyone. Long before she ever became queen, she had discovered a truth that many rulers never learned. Knowledge wasn't merely something impressive to possess. In dangerous times, it could become the most powerful weapon in an entire kingdom. By the time Cleopatra reached her late teens, she possessed an excellent education, spoke multiple languages, understood diplomacy better than many seasoned politicians, and had grown up watching palace intrigue unfold almost daily. Unfortunately, none of those qualifications guaranteed the one thing she actually needed: the throne. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died in 51 before Christ, his will attempted to solve the succession problem in the traditional Ptolemaic fashion. Cleopatra, around 18 years old, would rule alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only about 10 years old. There was one additional detail. According to royal custom, they were expected to marry. To modern ears, this sounds deeply unsettling. To the Ptolemies, it was simply Tuesday. The marriage wasn't intended to create a happy family life. It existed to keep the royal bloodline pure and to prevent outsiders from claiming the throne through marriage. History, however, repeatedly demonstrated that marrying your sibling does surprisingly little to reduce family arguments. Almost immediately, cracks began to appear. Although Cleopatra was officially co-ruler, she clearly intended to govern in her own right. Early official documents listed only her name. Coins were minted bearing her image. She appeared before officials independently and signed decrees without emphasizing her young brother's authority. This did not please the people surrounding the boy king. Because Ptolemy was still a child, real power rested in the hands of his advisors. 3 men became particularly influential: the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the rhetorician Theodotus. Together they realized that an intelligent, ambitious young queen was considerably harder to manipulate than a 10-year-old boy. Their solution was simple: remove Cleopatra. Court politics quickly became poisonous. Supporters chose sides, accusations spread through Alexandria, and before long Cleopatra found herself losing control of the government she had barely begun to rule. Eventually, she was forced to flee Egypt altogether. Imagine spending your entire childhood preparing to become queen, only to discover that within a couple of years you've been chased into exile by your little brother's advisors. Family reunions were unlikely to improve from that point onward. Cleopatra escaped eastward into Syria, where many rulers might have accepted defeat and quietly lived out the rest of their lives in comfortable obscurity. She had other ideas. Instead of surrendering, she began raising an army. This decision tells us something important about her character. Cleopatra wasn't waiting for someone to rescue her. She wasn't writing emotional letters, asking relatives to reconsider. She wasn't hoping the palace would suddenly apologize for the misunderstanding. She was preparing to march back and reclaim her kingdom. Meanwhile, Egypt drifted toward chaos. 2 rival governments now claimed legitimacy. Cleopatra gathered forces outside the country, while Ptolemy XIII remained in Alexandria under the guidance of his advisors. Civil war seemed increasingly inevitable. Then, quite unexpectedly, events in Rome transformed everything. Across the Mediterranean, Julius Caesar had just defeated his rival Pompey in another brutal Roman civil war. Pompey fled across the sea seeking refuge in Egypt, believing the young king would honour old alliances. Instead, the king's advisors made what they believed was a brilliant political calculation. They murdered Pompey before Caesar even arrived. It was meant as a gift. It would prove to be one of the greatest diplomatic miscalculations in ancient history. And for Cleopatra, it presented the opportunity she had been waiting for. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 before Christ, he probably expected a short diplomatic visit. Instead, he walked directly into one of the most complicated family disputes in ancient history. Rome had just endured years of civil war. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, defeated rival armies across Greece, Italy and Spain, and finally chased his greatest opponent, Pompey the Great, all the way to Egypt. Pompey believed Egypt would welcome him. After all, Cleopatra's father had owed much of his throne to Roman support, and Pompey himself had helped restore the Ptolemaic king years earlier. Surely Egypt would reward old friends. Instead, the advisors surrounding young Ptolemy XIII decided to impress Caesar by murdering Pompey before he even reached shore. The plan sounded clever during the meeting. It sounded considerably less clever once Caesar actually arrived. According to ancient historians, Caesar was presented with Pompey's severed head as a diplomatic gift. Rather than thanking them, he was horrified. Pompey had been his political rival, certainly, but he had also once been his ally, his son-in-law, and one of Rome's greatest generals. Romans admired victory, but they also respected dignity. Executing a defeated guest who had come seeking protection did not exactly scream trustworthy allies. The advisors had hoped to earn Caesar's gratitude. Instead, they earned his suspicion. Suddenly, Caesar found himself in the middle of Egypt's succession crisis. Two rulers claimed the throne. One was the young king controlled by ambitious advisors. The other was an exiled queen gathering supporters just beyond Egypt's borders. Cleopatra immediately recognized something that many politicians fail to notice. Moments of chaos often create opportunities. She knew that simply marching into Alexandria with an army would likely fail. Caesar already occupied the city with his veterans. If she appeared as another invading force, she risked making herself look like the aggressor. She needed something far more powerful, a private conversation. Getting one, however, was easier imagined than accomplished. The royal palace was firmly controlled by her brother's supporters. Guards watched every entrance, and anyone openly loyal to Cleopatra risked immediate arrest. Walking through the front gate while announcing, "Good evening, I'd like to discuss the throne with Julius Caesar," was unlikely to produce favourable results. So Cleopatra chose a far more memorable entrance. Ancient writers tell us that she secretly entered Alexandria under cover of darkness. Her loyal servant, Apollodorus of Sicily, smuggled her into the palace concealed inside a large bundle of bedding or a linen sack. Over the centuries, this gradually evolved into the famous story that she emerged from a rolled-up carpet. It is one of history's most enduring images. Whether it was actually a carpet, a rug, or simply a large sack of fabric remains uncertain. The important detail isn't the furniture. It's the strategy. Rather than relying on beauty, wealth, or military force, Cleopatra relied on surprise, courage, and impeccable timing. She placed herself directly before the most powerful man in the Roman world before anyone else had the chance to influence him. Imagine Caesar's evening. One moment you're reviewing documents about Egyptian politics. The next, someone unrolls what appears to be expensive laundry, and out climbs the exiled queen you've been hearing about for days. It's certainly one way to guarantee the meeting won't be forgotten. More importantly, it gave Cleopatra exactly what she wanted. Not romance, not immediate victory, something far more valuable. The chance to speak for herself before anyone else could tell her story. By the time Cleopatra finished her first private meeting with Julius Caesar, very little had actually changed. She wasn't queen again. Her brother still occupied the palace. The Egyptian court still wanted her gone. And Caesar still commanded fewer than 4,000 Roman soldiers inside a city whose population greatly outnumbered him. Yet everything had changed, because Caesar had now heard both sides of the story. For years, countless books, films, and television series have suggested that Cleopatra won Caesar over through irresistible beauty alone. It's certainly a romantic explanation. It also ignores one rather inconvenient fact. Julius Caesar was 52 years old. He had spent more than 3 decades navigating Roman politics, defeating rival generals, surviving assassination attempts, suppressing rebellions, and outmaneuvering some of the sharpest minds of his generation. This was a man who had negotiated with tribal chiefs, senators, kings, pirates, and political enemies before breakfast. He was not easily manipulated. If simply being attractive were enough to control Julius Caesar, Rome would have collapsed much earlier. Instead, Caesar saw something much more valuable. He saw competence. Cleopatra arrived prepared. She knew Egypt's political situation better than anyone. She explained how her father's will had legally named both siblings as joint rulers. She exposed the influence of the advisors controlling her younger brother, and likely emphasized that she, unlike them, could offer stability. And stability was exactly what Caesar wanted. Rome depended heavily on Egyptian grain. Every year, enormous shipments crossed the Mediterranean, feeding hundreds of thousands of Romans. A stable Egypt meant a stable food supply. A A civil war in Egypt threatened both Rome's economy and Caesar's political future. Choosing between Cleopatra and the advisors wasn't simply deciding which royal sibling seemed more pleasant. It was deciding who was most likely to govern effectively. Caesar had built his career on recognizing talented people. He wasn't searching for the most beautiful queen. He was searching for the safest investment. The advisors surrounding Ptolemy XIII quickly realized that Caesar was slipping beyond their influence. That made them nervous. Very nervous. They demanded that Caesar leave Egypt. They insisted he had no authority to interfere in Egyptian affairs. Caesar calmly replied that he was merely carrying out the wishes of the late king's will, which had actually asked Rome to oversee the succession if necessary. Whether this was genuine concern for Egyptian law or remarkably convenient legal interpretation depends entirely on whom you ask. Either way, Caesar wasn't leaving. The palace atmosphere became increasingly tense. Meetings grew colder. Guards watched one another carefully. Every conversation carried political consequences. Outside the palace, supporters of both rulers gathered throughout Alexandria. Rumours spread faster than facts. One version of events would circulate in the morning, only to be replaced by an even more dramatic version before sunset. Ancient cities didn't have social media, but they certainly had gossip. In some respects, it worked even faster. Then the situation exploded. Achilles, commander of the Egyptian army and loyal to Ptolemy's advisors, marched toward Alexandria with roughly 20,000 soldiers. Caesar suddenly found himself trapped. His small Roman force occupied the royal quarter, surrounded by a hostile city and facing an army several times its size. It was no longer simply Cleopatra's struggle for the throne. It had become Caesar's struggle to survive. For Cleopatra, there was now no turning back. She had gambled everything on one Roman general. If Caesar fell, she would almost certainly fall with him. Fortunately for both of them, Julius Caesar had developed an unfortunate habit for his enemies. The more impossible the situation appeared, the more dangerous he tended to become. If Cleopatra thought that convincing Julius Caesar to support her claim would immediately place the crown back on her head, the next few months were a rather unpleasant reminder that politics rarely works that efficiently. Winning an ally and winning a kingdom were two very different things. The moment Caesar declared that he intended to settle the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother, Alexandria erupted into chaos. Ptolemy XIII's advisors had already lost the political battle inside the palace. They intended to win the military one outside it. Achilles, commander of the Egyptian army, marched on Alexandria with tens of thousands of soldiers. Caesar, meanwhile, had fewer than 4,000 legionaries. Those are not odds most military commanders would voluntarily choose. Fortunately for Caesar, voluntarily choosing sensible odds had never really been one of his hobbies. Rather than abandoning the palace, he fortified the royal quarter. His soldiers secured key buildings, blocked streets, and established defensive positions overlooking the harbour. Every wall became a fortress, every doorway a checkpoint, and every rooftop suddenly seemed like an excellent place for someone carrying a spear. On the morning of the 15th of March, 44 before Christ, Cleopatra was still in Rome. She had every reason to believe the future looked promising. Egypt was stable. Her throne was secure. Her relationship with Julius Caesar had elevated her kingdom to a position of enormous importance. Rome and Egypt were cooperating more closely than they had in generations, and her young son, Caesarion, represented what she hoped would become a lasting bond between the two powers. Then, within a matter of minutes, everything unravelled. Caesar entered the theatre of Pompey to attend a meeting of the Senate. Ironically, the building was named after Pompey the Great, the very rival Caesar had defeated only a few years earlier. History occasionally enjoys arranging these little coincidences, as if it were trying a bit too hard to impress future historians. As Caesar took his seat, a group of senators surrounded him. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary petition. Then one senator grabbed his toga, another drew a dagger, Within moments, dozens of blades flashed through the crowd. Ancient sources tell us Caesar was stabbed 23 times. Whether every wound landed or not is still debated, but one fact is certain. The most powerful man in the Roman world lay dead before the Senate meeting had truly begun. The assassins believed they had saved the Roman Republic. Instead, they guaranteed years of civil war. News spread across Rome with astonishing speed. Markets emptied, doors slammed shut. Crowds gathered in confusion. No one knew what would happen next. Whenever the most powerful politician in the country is suddenly murdered, people generally become reluctant to make long-term dinner plans. For Cleopatra, the danger was immediate. She was not merely a foreign visitor. She was Caesar's closest royal ally. She had lived in Rome under his protection. Many Romans believed, correctly or not, that she had considerable influence over him. If angry crowds wanted someone else to blame for Caesar's growing ambition, an Egyptian queen made a very convenient target. There is no evidence that Cleopatra had any knowledge of the assassination beforehand, nor did she play any role in Roman politics beyond protecting Egypt's interests. But in times of chaos, facts often travel much more slowly than rumours. She acted quickly. Rather than becoming involved in Rome's unfolding power struggle, Cleopatra quietly prepared to leave the city. She gathered her household, her advisors, her young brother Ptolemy XIV, and her son Caesarion. Within days, she was sailing back toward Alexandria. It was probably the wisest decision she could have made. Behind her, Rome descended into uncertainty. Mark Antony attempted to seize control. The assassins hoped to restore the Republic. A young man named Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, barely 18 years old, returned to Italy to claim his inheritance. At the time, few people considered Octavian the most dangerous figure in Roman politics. He seemed inexperienced, physically unimpressive, and far younger than his rivals. History has repeatedly demonstrated that underestimating quiet young politicians is rarely an excellent career choice. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra faced another difficult challenge. Caesar, the man whose support had secured her throne, was gone. Everything she had built over the past 4 years suddenly rested on uncertain foundations. Even more importantly, Caesar had left behind no official recognition of Caesarion as his heir. Instead, his will named Octavian as his adopted son. That single document changed the future of Rome, and although Cleopatra could not yet know it, it had also begun the countdown to the greatest conflict of her entire reign. After Julius Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra did something that often goes unnoticed. She waited. That might not sound particularly exciting, but in politics, knowing when not to act can be every bit as important as knowing when to charge into battle. While Rome tore itself apart once again, Cleopatra focused on strengthening Egypt. Taxes were collected, trade resumed, grain exports continued, and Alexandria remained one of the wealthiest cities in the Mediterranean. She understood something many ambitious rulers forget. Civil wars eventually end. The survivors remember who stayed useful. Over the next few years, Rome descended into yet another struggle for power. Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted general, joined forces with the young Octavian and Marcus Lepidus to form what historians call the Second Triumvirate. Together, they hunted down Caesar's assassins, defeating Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi. With their enemies gone, the victors divided the Roman world between themselves. Octavian took the west, Antony governed the east, and the east happened to include Egypt. Soon enough, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey. Officially, he wanted answers. During Rome's recent conflicts, Cleopatra had remained carefully neutral, though she had provided limited support where it best protected Egypt's interests. Antony wanted to know exactly where her loyalties lay. Many people imagine Cleopatra nervously preparing to defend herself. Instead, she prepared a performance. Not because she intended to seduce Antony, because she intended to impress him. According to Plutarch, Cleopatra sailed into Tarsus aboard an extraordinary royal barge. Purple sails caught the wind, silver oars flashed in the sunlight, musicians played softly across the water, and fragrant incense drifted through the air. Servants dressed as mythical figures surrounded the queen while she herself appeared as the goddess Aphrodite. It sounds almost theatrical. That was precisely the point. Cleopatra understood symbolism better than almost anyone alive. She wasn't introducing herself as another nervous client, begging Rome for protection. She was reminding Antony that Egypt was ancient, wealthy, sophisticated, and unlike any other kingdom under Roman influence. In modern terms, she wasn't attending the meeting. She was hosting it. Even though Antony had issued the invitation, the effect was immediate. Plutarch writes that Antony, expecting Cleopatra to appear before his court, instead found himself accepting her invitation to dine aboard the royal ship. Somehow, within a single afternoon, the balance of the meeting had quietly shifted. That was no accident. Cleopatra had spent her entire life studying people. She understood that first impressions were political weapons. Luxury could communicate power, confidence could reshape negotiations, and making someone curious was often more effective than trying desperately to please them. Mark Antony was captivated, not simply by Cleopatra herself, but by the world she represented. Unlike Julius Caesar, who had arrived in Egypt as a conqueror, Antony encountered a queen who already knew exactly how Roman politics worked. She was no longer the young ruler fighting to reclaim her throne. She had become an experienced monarch who had survived civil war, outlived rivals, rebuilt her kingdom, and learned one of history's greatest lessons. Power wasn't about making an entrance. It was about making sure everyone remembered it long after you had left the room. By the time Cleopatra and Mark Antony had become allies, something remarkable had happened. Cleopatra was no longer simply reacting to history, she was shaping it. The frightened young queen who had once been smuggled into Caesar's palace, wrapped in bedding, had disappeared. In her place stood a confident monarch who had ruled Egypt for nearly 2 decades, survived civil war, defeated rival siblings, negotiated with Rome's greatest leaders, and restored stability to one of the richest kingdoms in the ancient world. She had become exactly the ruler she had spent her childhood preparing to be. Yet oddly enough, this is the point where many popular retellings stop talking about her government altogether. Instead, they focus almost exclusively on romance. It's a bit like writing the biography of Winston Churchill and spending 90% of the book discussing his favourite breakfast. Interesting, perhaps, but you're probably missing the main story. While Antony spent much of his time organising Rome's eastern provinces, Cleopatra remained busy governing Egypt. The kingdom's prosperity depended on careful administration. Every year, officials measured the Nile's flooding because too little water meant poor harvests, while too much water threatened villages and farmland. Taxes had to be adjusted, grain distributed, ports supervised, merchants protected, and foreign trade encouraged. None of this makes particularly exciting Hollywood cinema. No one has ever dramatically whispered, "Quick, the annual tax assessments are ready." Yet these ordinary decisions kept Egypt wealthy. Alexandria continued to flourish as the commercial heart of the eastern Mediterranean. Ships arrived daily carrying goods from Greece, Arabia, Africa, and India. Grain, papyrus, glass, perfumes, wine, precious stones, ivory, spices, and luxury textiles flowed through its enormous harbours. Trade was the kingdom's lifeblood. Cleopatra understood that political power rested upon economic strength. A poor kingdom could not remain independent for long. A wealthy kingdom, however, became valuable to everyone. She also invested heavily in religious legitimacy. Egyptian pharaohs were not merely political rulers. They were expected to maintain harmony between humanity and the gods. Cleopatra embraced traditional Egyptian ceremonies far more enthusiastically than most of her Greek-speaking ancestors had done. She appeared publicly dressed as the goddess Isis. To modern audiences, this might sound like clever public relations. In many ways, it was. But it also reflected genuine royal tradition. Egyptian rulers had linked themselves with the gods for thousands of years before Cleopatra was born. She simply understood that respecting Egyptian customs strengthened her authority among her own people. Meanwhile, Roman visitors often found themselves impressed by something else entirely: her conversations. Ancient writers repeatedly mention that Cleopatra could speak intelligently about politics, literature, science, philosophy, and diplomacy. She possessed that rare ability to make powerful men feel they were speaking with an equal rather than simply addressing another monarch. That quality cannot easily be captured in marble, nor can it be shown on a coin, which may explain why later generations quietly ignored it. Beauty is simple to paint. Intelligence requires storytelling, and storytelling takes considerably more effort than adding another layer of gold jewellery. By now, Cleopatra had built something extraordinary. Not merely a famous romance, not merely a glamorous court, but one of the most stable and prosperous kingdoms in a Mediterranean world that seemed increasingly determined to solve every disagreement with another civil war. Unfortunately, peace rarely lasts forever. Back in Rome, a young ruler named Octavian had been watching everything very carefully, and he was already beginning to understand that defeating Mark Antony would require defeating Cleopatra first, even if only in the minds of the Roman people. By the middle of the 1st century before Christ, Cleopatra had become something rather inconvenient. She was successful. Not simply successful by Egyptian standards, but successful enough to worry Rome's most ambitious politician. His name was Octavian. The young man who had once seemed too inexperienced to compete with seasoned generals had steadily eliminated his rivals. Lepidus had been pushed aside. Antony remained powerful, but he now spent much of his time in the eastern Mediterranean alongside Cleopatra. From Octavian's perspective, this wasn't merely a political problem. It was a public relations opportunity. Modern political campaigns often rely on television interviews, newspaper headlines, carefully edited videos, and social media posts. The Romans had something arguably even more effective: rumours, poets, public speeches, coins, and an audience that absolutely loved dramatic scandals. Octavian understood that defeating Antony on the battlefield might prove difficult. Defeating his reputation, however, could begin immediately. So he launched one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. His message was remarkably simple. Mark Antony was no longer behaving like a proper Roman. He had abandoned Roman discipline. He had abandoned Roman values. Worst of all, he had fallen under the influence of a dangerous foreign queen. Notice something interesting. Octavian rarely attacked Cleopatra for being ugly. He rarely even claimed she was extraordinarily beautiful. Instead, he portrayed her as something much more frightening. A cunning, manipulative Eastern monarch who intended to dominate Rome through Antony. To Roman audiences, this struck a nerve. Rome had spent centuries celebrating its victories over foreign kings. The idea that a Roman general might serve an Egyptian queen felt humiliating. Octavian encouraged people to believe that Antony wasn't making his own decisions anymore. He was supposedly enchanted, bewitched, controlled. It was a wonderfully convenient explanation. After all, admitting that Antony had formed a deliberate political alliance with one of the Mediterranean's most capable rulers required considerably more thought. Blaming everything on one irresistible woman was much easier. Some things, it seems, never change. Meanwhile, Antony wasn't exactly helping himself. He openly spent time in Alexandria. He celebrated Egyptian ceremonies. He fathered children with Cleopatra. He granted eastern territories to Cleopatra and their children during a famous event historians call the Donations of Alexandria. To Cleopatra, these decisions strengthened her dynasty. To Octavian, they became political gold. He claimed Antony intended to divide Roman territory among foreign rulers. He suggested that Antony wished to move the centre of power from Rome to Alexandria. There was little evidence for many of these accusations. Evidence, however, is not always essential for effective propaganda. If a story confirms what people already fear, it spreads remarkably quickly. Even Antony's supporters struggled to answer every rumour. The campaign reached its peak when Octavian obtained Antony's will. Exactly how he acquired it remains controversial, since Roman wills were supposed to remain sealed until death. Nevertheless, Octavian publicly read portions of it before the Senate. According to the document, Antony wished to be buried beside Cleopatra in Alexandria. For many Romans, that single detail sounded almost like betrayal. A Roman hero choosing Egypt over Rome? Outrage followed almost immediately. Octavian had carefully transformed what was really another Roman civil war into something entirely different. He wasn't fighting Antony anymore. Officially, Rome was going to war against Cleopatra. It was brilliant politics. And tragically for Cleopatra, it also ensured that history would remember her not as the accomplished queen who governed Egypt for more than 20 years, but as the foreign temptress Rome claimed had bewitched one of its greatest generals. The myth was winning. The war was about to decide whether the woman behind it would survive. By the year 31 before Christ, there was no longer any realistic hope of avoiding war. The alliance between Octavian and Mark Antony had completely collapsed. Years of accusations had poisoned any chance of reconciliation, and Cleopatra found herself standing beside the one Roman leader who could still challenge Octavian's growing power. History often presents this moment as a simple love story. Antony chose Cleopatra over Rome. Rome became angry. Everyone fought. Reality, as usual, was considerably more complicated. This was a struggle over who would control the Roman world. Cleopatra understood exactly what was at stake. If Antony defeated Octavian, Egypt would almost certainly remain an independent kingdom, protected by the strongest military alliance in the Mediterranean. Her children would inherit a secure dynasty, and Alexandria could continue flourishing as one of the world's greatest cities. If Octavian won, Egypt would become a Roman possession. The Ptolemaic dynasty would almost certainly disappear, and Cleopatra herself would likely become the prize of the victor. Neither outcome left much room for compromise. During the months leading up to the final campaign, Antony and Cleopatra assembled an enormous force. Their combined fleet numbered hundreds of ships, accompanied by tens of thousands of soldiers stationed throughout Greece. It was one of the largest military operations the ancient Mediterranean had ever witnessed. On paper, their chances looked remarkably good. Reality, however, had begun quietly working against them. Antony's officers argued among themselves. Supplies became increasingly difficult to manage. Disease spread through crowded camps. Several important commanders lost confidence and defected to Octavian's side. Every week seemed to bring another unpleasant surprise. Military campaigns have a remarkable habit of refusing to follow optimistic planning meetings. Meanwhile, Octavian possessed one enormous advantage: his brilliant admiral, Marcus Agrippa. While Octavian often receives most of the credit for victory, Agrippa was arguably one of the greatest naval commanders Rome ever produced. Patient, disciplined, and relentlessly practical, he steadily captured strategic ports, disrupted Antony's supply lines, and forced his enemies into increasingly difficult positions. By the time the two fleets finally met near the Greek coast at Actium, Antony was no longer fighting on his own terms. The battle began on the 2nd of September. Unlike the dramatic naval clashes shown in films, ancient sea battles were often slow, confusing affairs. Massive warships manoeuvred awkwardly across the water, while crews struggled to ram enemy vessels or board them with infantry. Smoke from burning ships mixed with shouted orders, flying arrows, and the constant crash of wood against wood. Somewhere within this chaos, Cleopatra commanded her own Egyptian squadron. She wasn't watching comfortably from a distant palace balcony. She was present with the fleet, risking exactly the same defeat as everyone else. Then came the decision historians have debated for 2,000 years. At a crucial moment, Cleopatra's 60 ships suddenly broke through an opening in the fighting and sailed south toward Egypt. Antony saw them leaving. Without warning, he abandoned the battle and followed. To later Roman writers, this became the ultimate proof that Antony had sacrificed victory for love. Modern historians are far less certain. Some argue it was a planned withdrawal intended to preserve the treasury and remaining fleet. Others believe the battle had already been lost, making escape the only rational option. The truth remains uncertain, because the surviving accounts were largely written by authors living under Octavian's rule. What is certain is the result. The remaining fleet surrendered. Octavian had won. For Cleopatra, the consequences were immediate. The queen, who had spent more than 20 years preserving Egypt's independence, now faced the one future she had worked her entire life to prevent. Rome was coming. And this time, there would be no Julius Caesar arriving to save her. When Octavian entered Alexandria in 30 before Christ, Cleopatra already knew how the story was supposed to end. Not the version historians would eventually write. Her own story. She had ruled Egypt for more than 20 years. She had survived palace conspiracies, civil wars, exile, Roman invasions, and enough family betrayals to make future royal dynasties seem surprisingly functional by comparison. She had outlived 2 brothers, formed alliances with the 2 most powerful Romans of her age, rebuilt her kingdom, and preserved Egypt's independence longer than almost anyone thought possible. Now there was only one battle left. The battle over how she would be remembered. Mark Antony, devastated by the defeat at Actium, attempted one final defence of Alexandria. It was brave, determined, and ultimately hopeless. Octavian's forces advanced steadily toward the city, defeating what remained of Antony's army. Then disaster struck. A false rumour spread that Cleopatra had taken her own life. Upon hearing the news, Antony believed everything was lost. Rather than allowing himself to be captured, he fell upon his sword. Ancient historians tell us the attempt did not kill him immediately. Gravely wounded, he was carried to the mausoleum, where Cleopatra had locked herself inside with a handful of loyal attendants. According to Plutarch, the doors remained sealed, so Antony had to be lifted through a high window using ropes. It is one of history's most tragic scenes. The aging Roman general, who had once commanded vast armies across 3 continents, being painfully hauled into the arms of the woman he loved. He died there beside Cleopatra. With Antony gone, Octavian finally came face to face with Egypt's queen. Contrary to later legends, he treated her with considerable caution. He understood her value. If Cleopatra could be taken alive to Rome, she would become the centerpiece of his triumph, a public parade celebrating his victory before cheering crowds. Roman triumphs often displayed defeated kings and queens in chains. It was political theatre on the grandest possible scale. Octavian wanted Cleopatra alive. Cleopatra understood exactly why. She had spent enough time in Rome to know what awaited defeated rulers. She would not allow herself to become another trophy. Over the following days, Octavian attempted to reassure her. He promised fair treatment, encouraged cooperation, and tried to convince her that surrender remained her best option. Whether he genuinely intended to spare her or simply wished to prevent her suicide remains impossible to know. Cleopatra, however, made her own calculations. For perhaps the final time, she chose control over uncertainty. The exact manner of her death remains one of history's greatest mysteries. The famous story tells of an Egyptian cobra, the sacred asp, hidden inside a basket of figs. Other ancient writers suggested poison concealed in a hairpin, or a carefully prepared mixture of deadly substances. Modern historians continue debating which version is most likely. The truth disappeared with Cleopatra herself. She died at the age of 39. With her death, nearly 300 years of Ptolemaic rule came to an end. Egypt became a Roman province, and Octavian soon transformed himself into Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Yet history's final irony was only beginning. Octavian had defeated Cleopatra on the battlefield. His propaganda would defeat her for the next 2,000 years. The brilliant linguist became the beautiful queen. The accomplished administrator became the seductress. The ruler who preserved Egypt through one of antiquity's most dangerous eras became remembered mainly for her romances. And perhaps that is Cleopatra's greatest tragedy. Not that she lost her kingdom, but that one of history's most capable rulers became famous for something the ancient writers themselves rarely claimed was exceptional. Her beauty became immortal. Her brilliance deserved the same. Long before Henry VIII settled into his chair, before the first goblet of wine was poured, or the first roast appeared beneath glittering silver platters, Hampton Court Palace was already awake. The royal meal did not begin when the king entered the room. In truth, it had begun hours earlier, while most of England was still rubbing sleep from its eyes. Feeding the most powerful man in the kingdom was less like preparing dinner and more like organising a carefully rehearsed military campaign, except this army fought with ladles instead of swords. Every morning, servants hurried through endless corridors, carrying baskets of vegetables, barrels of ale, sacks of flour, fresh herbs, and entire sides of beef. Deliveries arrived from royal estates across England, bringing the finest ingredients available. Fish came from rivers and the coast, game arrived from royal hunting parks, while gardens supplied fresh greens that had often been picked only moments before. Nothing was left to chance. A disappointing meal reflected poorly on everyone involved, from the lowliest kitchen boy to the Lord Steward himself. The kitchens at Hampton Court were astonishingly large. More than 50 rooms were dedicated solely to preparing food. Massive fireplaces roared continuously, each large enough to roast several animals at once. The air was thick with wood smoke, sizzling fat, and the constant shouting of cooks trying to coordinate dozens of different dishes simultaneously. It was loud, hot, and exhausting. Anyone expecting a peaceful culinary experience would have been deeply disappointed within the first 5 minutes. Hundreds of servants worked together in carefully organised teams. Some butchered meat, while others kneaded bread or stirred enormous cauldrons filled with soup and stew. Young boys spent entire shifts turning heavy roasting spits by hand, so the meat cooked evenly. Imagine explaining to your parents that your career ambition was spending 12 hours rotating a pig over a fire. Tudor career counselling was not especially inspiring. Every task followed strict rules. Timing mattered, because many dishes had to reach the king while still steaming hot. Unlike today, there were no ovens keeping food warm, and certainly no microwave waiting to rescue a forgotten pie. Once a meal left the kitchen, dozens of servants formed an intricate chain, carrying each platter through corridors and courtyards toward the great hall or the king's private apartments. Yet the greatest challenge had nothing to do with cooking itself. Every loaf of bread, every goblet of wine, every slice of meat was destined for a king who trusted very few people. Before Henry ever lifted his knife, another elaborate ritual had to unfold, one designed not to impress his guests, but to ensure the meal would not become his last. If the royal kitchens were the heart of Hampton Court Palace, then the people working inside them were its tireless heartbeat. By the time Henry VIII's dinner approached, hundreds of men and women had already been labouring for hours. Some had started before sunrise, while others had barely slept after preparing the previous evening's feast. Feeding one king and the enormous household that surrounded him required one of the largest domestic workforces in Tudor England. At its peak, Henry's household numbered well over 1,000 people. Not all of them ate alongside the king, of course, but many depended on the palace kitchens for their daily meals. Every day, enormous quantities of food disappeared into hungry mouths. Several oxen, dozens of sheep, countless chickens, mountains of bread, barrels of ale, and rivers of wine seemed to vanish almost as quickly as they arrived. Medieval logistics had evolved into Tudor logistics, and somehow they had become even more complicated. The great kitchens themselves were divided into specialised departments. There was a boiling house for soups and stews, a roasting kitchen with enormous open hearths, pastry kitchens where elaborate pies were assembled, bakehouses producing fresh bread, confectionaries preparing sweet dishes, and separate rooms for sauces, spices, and preserving food. Each area had its own hierarchy, with experienced masters directing apprentices who hoped one day to earn a better position. Perhaps no job was more exhausting than that of the spit boy. His task sounded simple: turn the heavy iron spit so the roasting meat cooked evenly. In reality, it meant standing beside blazing fires for hours, carefully rotating entire pigs, deer, or sides of beef without letting the meat burn. It was hot enough to make anyone reconsider every life choice that had led them to that fireplace. On particularly busy days, they probably smelled more roasted than the dinner itself. Elsewhere, butchers worked with astonishing speed, reducing entire carcasses into usable cuts before passing them to cooks. Bakers carried trays of fresh bread from massive ovens, while brewers ensured ale remained plentiful. Water was not always the safest drink, so even ordinary servants often consumed weak ale throughout the day. Contrary to popular imagination, they were not constantly staggering around drunk. The ale was usually much weaker than modern beer, and often safer than whatever floated in the nearest well. As impressive as this army of workers was, none of their efforts mattered if the meal reached Henry cold, or worse, unsafe. Once every dish had been prepared to perfection, another carefully choreographed ritual began. The food was about to leave the kitchens, and from this point onward, every step was governed by ceremony, security, and absolute precision. Preparing Henry VIII's dinner was only half the battle. Getting it safely from the roaring kitchens to the royal table was an equally delicate operation. The palace was vast, its corridors twisting through courtyards, staircases, galleries, and guarded doorways. A meal might travel several hundred yards before reaching the king. Every step had to be carefully managed because by this point, the food was no longer just dinner. It had become a matter of royal security. The procession began with senior kitchen officials inspecting every dish one final time. Platters were wiped clean around the edges, sauces adjusted, garnishes arranged with surprising care. Presentation mattered almost as much as flavour. Henry enjoyed displays of abundance, and his meals were expected to look as impressive as the wealth of his kingdom. A simple roast chicken might be accompanied by colourful fruits, herbs, elaborate pastries, or decorative sugar sculptures that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Almost. Once approved, servants formed an orderly procession. Each person knew exactly which platter they carried, and precisely where they belonged in the line. This was not a chaotic stampede of hungry cooks escaping a hot kitchen. It was a carefully rehearsed ceremony that reflected the rigid hierarchy of Tudor society. The closer a servant came to handling the king's food, the higher his rank usually was. Carrying Henry's dinner was considered an honour, but also a responsibility. Dropping the king's roast in front of half the court was unlikely to improve one's career prospects. As the procession wound through Hampton Court, guards watched the route carefully. Unauthorised people were kept well away from the dishes. Doors were opened in advance, allowing the line of servants to move without interruption. Every unnecessary delay meant the food cooled slightly, and no one wanted to explain to Henry why his venison had arrived merely warm instead of properly steaming. The greatest concern, however, was not temperature. It was poison. Poison haunted the imagination of Renaissance courts. Political rivals, foreign agents, ambitious nobles, and disgruntled servants all existed in whispered stories of assassination. Whether every rumour was true hardly mattered. Henry believed the danger was real enough to justify extraordinary precautions. His father's dynasty had won the throne only after decades of civil war, and the Tudor crown still felt less than completely secure. A healthy level of paranoia came with wearing it. Before a single bite reached the king's lips, another ceremony now took centre stage. Trusted officers would examine the food, taste the wine, and publicly demonstrate that every course was safe. For Henry, surviving dinner sometimes seemed almost as important as enjoying it. By the time Henry VIII finally approached the dining chamber, his meal had already survived an obstacle course of cooks, servants, guards, and inspections. Yet one final ritual remained before the king could lift his knife. In an age when political alliances shifted as quickly as English weather, poison was considered one of the most terrifying weapons imaginable. A sword could be blocked, an assassin might be spotted, but a poisoned goblet looked exactly like an ordinary one until it was far too late. Whether the danger was as widespread as people believed is still debated by historians. Actual poisonings were relatively uncommon, but fear itself shaped behaviour. Kings did not need constant assassination attempts to become cautious. They only needed to hear enough stories to wonder whether the next meal might contain something more dangerous than too much pepper. That responsibility fell upon trusted officers known as the gentlemen servers and the royal tasters. Their position demanded absolute loyalty because they stood between the king and anyone who wished him harm. Every dish, every cup of wine, every loaf of bread passed through their hands before it ever reached Henry. One of the most important ceremonies was known as the ceremony of the tasting. It was performed publicly, allowing everyone present to witness that the food had been examined. A servant would taste selected dishes while another sampled the wine. They did not simply nibble politely to avoid offending the chef. They consumed enough to demonstrate genuine confidence that nothing dangerous lurked inside. Of course, modern films often exaggerate this practice, showing a nervous servant collapsing dramatically seconds later while everyone gasps. Real poison rarely behaved with such theatrical timing. If that had been common, court physicians would have become remarkably efficient detectives. Instead, many poisons worked slowly, making certainty difficult. The tasting ceremony was therefore partly practical and partly psychological. It reassured the king while reminding everyone else that protecting him was the household's highest priority. Henry himself remained alert throughout the ritual. Although famous for his enormous appetite, he was no careless eater. Years of political intrigue, rebellions, religious conflict, and shifting loyalties had taught him that a crown attracted enemies as reliably as fresh bread attracted hungry dogs. Trust was a valuable commodity at court, and it was distributed in very small portions. Only after every inspection had been completed, every goblet approved, and every servant had performed his assigned duty, could the king finally sit down. Yet even then, dinner was not merely a meal. The moment Henry entered the room, eating itself became a carefully choreographed performance, where every movement announced exactly who held power in Tudor England. The moment Henry VIII entered the dining chamber, the atmosphere changed completely. Conversations softened, servants straightened their posture, and every pair of eyes discreetly shifted toward the king. This was not simply because everyone respected him. It was because every movement Henry made carried meaning. Even eating his supper became a carefully choreographed ceremony that reinforced his authority over England. Unlike the lively banquets often shown in films, many of Henry's daily meals, particularly later in his reign, were surprisingly formal affairs. If dining in public, he often sat alone beneath an elaborate canopy, known as the cloth of estate. The elevated position physically separated him from everyone else in the room. Even surrounded by dozens of nobles, Henry remained unmistakably the centre of attention. The message required no explanation. There was the king, and then there was everyone else. His place at the table reflected this hierarchy perfectly. Fine linen covered the surface, polished silver gleamed beneath candlelight, and expensive goblets stood beside beautifully crafted plates. Contrary to popular belief, people did not eat from mountains of gold every day. Gold was certainly displayed on important occasions, but silver dominated royal dining because it was valuable, practical, and easier to maintain. Besides, polishing enough gold to satisfy Henry would have given an entire generation of servants permanent arm pain. Before Henry touched a single bite, several rituals unfolded. A senior servant presented water so the king could wash his hands. This was partly about cleanliness, but it was also symbolic. Washing before a meal demonstrated refinement and good breeding. In an age before modern hygiene, it was also one of the smarter habits anyone could develop, especially after spending the morning handling dogs, horses, documents, coins, and countless hands during court business. Only trusted attendants stood close enough to serve the king directly. They carved meat, poured wine, and replaced dishes with practiced precision. Every movement had been rehearsed countless times. There was no reaching awkwardly across the table or asking, "Would your Majesty mind passing the salt?" The servants anticipated Henry's needs before he spoke, and speaking unnecessarily while serving the king was generally discouraged. Around the room, nobles carefully observed proper etiquette. They understood that royal dinners were not simply opportunities to eat well. They were opportunities to be seen. A misplaced gesture, poor manners, or an accidental breach of protocol could damage a reputation that had taken years to build. Tudor politics often unfolded over roasted venison as much as it did inside council chambers. And while everyone admired the magnificent display, the food itself began arriving in waves. Henry's table was about to become a showcase of England's wealth, filled with dishes that ranged from comforting to astonishingly extravagant. Once the ceremony had been completed, and the first dishes appeared before Henry VIII, the sheer quantity of food could leave even the most enthusiastic modern buffet enthusiast feeling slightly intimidated. A royal dinner was never intended to be modest. It was designed to display wealth, stability, and power. Every overflowing platter quietly announced that England's king possessed enough resources to feed an army, even if only one man was doing most of the eating. Meals were served in what the Tudors called courses, but these did not resemble the neat progression of appetizer, main course, and dessert familiar today. Instead, each course consisted of numerous dishes arriving together. The table quickly filled with roasted meats, baked pies, stewed vegetables, fresh bread, fish, pastries, sauces, fruit, and elaborate decorations. Guests helped themselves according to rank and proximity, while Henry enjoyed the finest selections prepared specifically for him. Beef formed the backbone of many royal meals, but it was far from the only option. Venison from the king's hunting parks was especially prized, while swan, peacock, heron, crane, and even porpoise occasionally appeared during grand feasts. Some of these animals were served more for prestige than flavour. Eating roast peacock certainly impressed your guests, although one suspects the peacock remained unconvinced about the whole arrangement. The kitchen also prepared countless pies. Tudor pies were wonderfully practical. Some contained beef, others venison, rabbit, pigeon, eel, or combinations of several meats. Thick pastry cases often acted more like sturdy cooking containers than something meant to be eaten. After baking, the filling remained moist while the crust absorbed grease and protected the contents. Think of it as the 16th century equivalent of disposable cookware, except considerably heavier and far less likely to fit inside a modern dishwasher. Fish remained essential, particularly on religious fasting days when meat was forbidden by church rules. Salmon, trout, cod, herring, pike, oysters, mussels, and eels frequently appeared on royal tables. Clever cooks found endless ways to prepare them using herbs, wine, butter, vinegar, and imported spices. Tudor chefs understood that variety kept both diners and kings interested. Those imported spices represented astonishing wealth. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, mace, saffron, and pepper travelled thousands of miles before reaching England. They cost fortunes and were used generously in royal kitchens. Modern diners often expect medieval food to be bland, but Henry's cooks had quite the opposite philosophy. If a dish could hold another pinch of expensive spice, they usually added it. Yet despite this remarkable abundance, eating remained governed by strict etiquette. Knowing how to behave at the royal table mattered almost as much as knowing what was being served, because one careless mistake could attract exactly the kind of attention no courtier wanted. A royal meal under Henry VIII was not simply about satisfying hunger. It was also an examination that everyone present took, whether they realised it or not. Every movement, every gesture, and every word could reveal breeding, education, loyalty, and social rank. The food might have been magnificent, but the real performance was taking place around the table. One of the first rules concerned where you sat. Seating was never random. The closer someone sat to the king, the greater their importance. Powerful nobles occupied the most prestigious places, while lesser courtiers found themselves farther away. Some important guests were fortunate enough to dine in Henry's presence. Others, despite holding respectable positions, ate elsewhere in the palace. Being invited to the king's table was a privilege that could raise a person's reputation almost overnight. Conversation itself followed invisible rules. People did not interrupt the king or loudly dominate discussions. When Henry spoke, others listened carefully. If he asked a question, the answer needed to be thoughtful without sounding overly rehearsed. Speak too little, and you appear dull. Speak too much, and you risked appearing arrogant. Navigating Tudor conversation required the balance of a tightrope walker carrying a tray of expensive wine. Table manners were equally important. Diners washed their hands before eating, partly for cleanliness, and partly because many foods were handled directly with the fingers. Forks, although beginning to appear elsewhere in Europe, had not yet become common in England. Most people relied on knives, spoons, and their hands. This sounds messy by modern standards, but there were strict expectations about how those hands should be used. Guests were expected to eat neatly and with restraint. Grabbing the largest portion, stuffing one's mouth, or reaching awkwardly across the table reflected badly on a person's character. Bread often served as both food and utensil, helping to scoop sauces or accompany meat. Bones and scraps were placed carefully aside rather than tossed carelessly onto the floor, despite what many modern films suggest. Tudor nobles appreciated elegance, even if their dinners involved considerably more gravy than today's formal banquets. Napkins, usually made of linen, rested across the lap or over one shoulder. Wiping greasy fingers on expensive clothing was strongly discouraged, a rule that has somehow survived remarkably well into the present day. Human civilization has achieved many things, but agreeing not to clean butter off your sleeves remains one of its quieter successes. Perhaps most importantly, everyone watched everyone else. Courtiers observed rivals, ambassadors studied English customs, servants noticed shifting alliances, and Henry himself paid close attention to the behaviour of those around him. A royal dinner was one of the few places where politics, ambition, and etiquette occupied exactly the same table. By the time the final dishes began to disappear, the meal had accomplished far more than filling empty stomachs. It had reinforced the entire social order of Tudor England, one carefully choreographed dinner at a time. No matter how grand the meal had been, eventually the final platter was cleared away, the last goblet emptied, and the enormous performance surrounding Henry VIII's dinner began to wind down. Yet, even the ending followed traditions that had been refined over generations. A royal feast did not simply stop because everyone had eaten enough. Like every other part of Tudor court life, it concluded with ceremony, hierarchy, and one final reminder of who ruled England. As servants removed the dishes, they worked with the same quiet precision they had shown throughout the meal. Empty platters disappeared almost as quickly as they had arrived. Linen cloths were straightened, goblets collected, and crumbs brushed from the table. Nothing was left untidy for long. An orderly dining chamber reflected an orderly kingdom, at least in theory. In reality, keeping several hundred well-fed nobles perfectly organised was probably rather like attempting to herd geese that happened to own castles. Henry rarely lingered over dinner. Despite his love of food, ambassadors and visitors often remarked that he ate surprisingly quickly. He had matters of state waiting for him, petitions to review, council meetings to attend, ambassadors to receive, and disputes that required his attention. Running a kingdom left remarkably little time for leisurely conversation over dessert. That did not mean the evening immediately became quiet. Music frequently followed important meals. Skilled musicians played lutes, viols, flutes, and harps, while singers entertained the court. On especially festive occasions, jesters, acrobats, and actors performed before the king. Henry himself genuinely enjoyed music and was an accomplished musician in his younger years, composing songs and playing several instruments. Before age, injuries, and politics hardened his temperament, he had been considered one of the most athletic and cultured princes in Europe. Meanwhile, far from the royal apartments, another feast quietly unfolded. Once the king and his highest-ranking guests had finished, food that remained was distributed throughout the enormous household according to rank. Senior officers received generous portions, while ordinary servants also benefited from the palace kitchens. Very little edible food was deliberately wasted. Leftovers fed hundreds of mouths, and sometimes even found their way to charitable distribution outside the palace gates. In an age when famine could still threaten entire communities, wasting perfectly good food would have seemed astonishingly irresponsible. As evening settled over Hampton Court, fires in the kitchens gradually burned lower, exhausted cooks scrubbed enormous pots, and servants prepared for another day that would begin before dawn. Tomorrow's meal was already occupying someone's thoughts. The king's appetite never took holidays. For Henry VIII, dinner had been far more than a chance to satisfy his hunger. It was a daily display of wealth, authority, loyalty, and tradition. Every roast, every servant, every ceremony, and every carefully observed rule reminded everyone present that the Tudor monarchy was not merely governing England, it was performing its power, one magnificent meal at a time. When Henry VIII finally rose from the table, dinner itself might have been over, but the work surrounding it was far from finished. While the king returned to matters of government, private conversation, or evening entertainment, hundreds of servants remained hard at work. A royal meal left behind mountains of dishes, exhausted cooks, smouldering fires, and enough leftover bread, bones, and empty barrels to keep an entire workforce occupied well into the night. If you had asked a samurai what his greatest possession was, he probably would not have pointed to his sword, his armour, his horse, or even his land. Instead, he would have given an answer that sounds almost unbelievable today. His greatest possession was his honour. Lose your house, and perhaps you could rebuild it. Lose your fortune, and another opportunity might eventually appear. But lose your honour, and in the eyes of feudal Japan, you had lost the very thing that made your life worth living. To understand the crimes that could destroy a samurai, you first have to understand the world he lived in. This was a society built on hierarchy. At the very top stood the shogun. Beneath him, powerful daimyo ruled their own territories, and below them served thousands of samurai whose entire identity revolved around duty, loyalty, and reputation. Every person knew exactly where they stood, and stepping outside that place often carried serious consequences. From an early age, boys born into samurai families were taught that courage, discipline, and self-control were not optional virtues. They were expectations. A future warrior learned to ride horses, master the bow, wield the spear, and eventually become skilled with the sword. Yet physical training was only part of the education. Just as important was learning how to behave. Respect toward superiors, kindness toward loyal servants, restraint during conflict, and absolute control over one's emotions were considered marks of true refinement. Losing your temper too easily suggested that you had not yet mastered yourself. This way of thinking became closely associated with what we now call Bushido, often translated as the way of the warrior. While the code evolved over centuries and was never written as one universal rulebook, its ideals shaped samurai culture. Loyalty, honesty, courage, justice, and honour formed the foundation of a warrior's life. Living by these principles brought respect. failing them invited disgrace. That disgrace reached far beyond the individual. A samurai's actions reflected upon his parents, his children, his ancestors, and the lord he served. One shameful act could stain an entire family for generations. Reputation travelled quickly through castle towns, and stories of cowardice or betrayal spread faster than official announcements. Long before newspapers or social media existed, people had perfected the ancient art of talking about other people's mistakes. Because of this, every decision carried enormous weight. A careless word, an act of dishonesty, or a moment of weakness could begin a chain of events that ended in exile, poverty, or even death. For a samurai, the greatest fear was not always dying in battle. It was living long enough to watch his honour disappear, piece by piece. That fear shaped every aspect of his life and made the crimes we are about to explore far more terrifying than they might first appear. If honour formed the soul of a samurai, then loyalty was the chain that held everything together. A samurai did not simply work for his lord in the modern sense of the word. His entire identity was tied to the daimyo he served. His income, his social standing, his family's future, and often his very reason for existing depended upon that relationship. To betray one's lord was not viewed as a simple crime. It was seen as an attack on the very order that held feudal Japan together. Every samurai swore allegiance to a daimyo, one of the great regional lords who governed lands on behalf of the shogun. In exchange for military service and unwavering obedience, the daimyo granted land, rice stipends, protection, and status. It was a relationship built upon mutual obligation, but the balance of power was hardly equal. A lord could reward faithful service with wealth and promotion. He could also strip everything away with a single command. Obedience extended far beyond the battlefield. A samurai might be ordered to collect taxes, oversee a castle gate, escort an important official, investigate a dispute between villages, or travel across dangerous provinces carrying confidential messages. Whatever the assignment, it was expected to be carried out faithfully and without unnecessary complaint. Refusing an order simply because it was unpleasant was almost unthinkable. Of course, reality was rarely so straightforward. Not every daimyo was wise, honourable, or even competent. Some were brilliant leaders who inspired fierce devotion. Others were arrogant, reckless, or consumed by personal ambition. This created a painful dilemma. What happened if a lord gave an order that seemed dishonourable? Should a samurai obey without question, or refuse in order to preserve his own sense of justice? Different warriors answered that question differently, and history remembers examples of both choices. Some believed loyalty demanded absolute obedience regardless of personal opinion. Others argued that true loyalty sometimes meant preventing a foolish lord from destroying himself. Neither path was without danger. Advising a powerful daimyo that he was making a terrible decision required extraordinary courage and perhaps an appreciation for very short careers. The greatest betrayal, however, was openly turning against one's lord. Joining a rival clan, revealing military secrets, abandoning the battlefield without permission, or plotting assassination ranked among the gravest crimes imaginable. Such acts threatened not only one man, but the security of entire provinces. Punishments were severe. Property could be confiscated, families disgraced, and the offender sentenced to execution or ordered to take his own life through ritual suicide. Yet even a samurai who remained loyal could lose everything through another failing that every warrior dreaded. In battle, courage was expected. Showing fear at the wrong moment could destroy a reputation just as completely as betrayal ever could. For a samurai, few accusations carried more shame than being called a coward. Losing a battle was unfortunate. Being overwhelmed by impossible odds could even earn respect. But abandoning one's duty through fear was something entirely different. It was a stain that could follow a warrior for the rest of his life, long after the wounds of battle had healed and the banners had been folded away. From childhood, samurai were taught that death was always a possibility. Every lesson with the sword, every hour spent practicing archery from horseback, and every lecture on discipline prepared them for a simple reality. One day they might be asked to risk everything for their lord. The expectation was not that they would survive. The expectation was that they would stand their ground. This did not mean samurai were fearless. They were human beings after all. An arrow flying toward your face tends to inspire the same universal reaction regardless of culture or century. Horses panicked, drums thundered across the valley, smoke filled the air, and soldiers watched friends fall around them. Fear was unavoidable. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to continue despite it. Battle itself was often far more chaotic than popular stories suggest. Films frequently portray elegant duels between famous warriors, while everyone else politely waits for the outcome. Reality was considerably messier. Arrows darkened the sky, spear formations collided, cavalry charged through muddy fields, and commands were sometimes impossible to hear over the noise. A samurai had to make life or death decisions within seconds, often with very little information. Running away without orders, abandoning one's post, or leaving fellow warriors exposed could have disastrous consequences. A single retreat at the wrong moment might open a gap in the battle line, allowing enemy troops to break through and turn an orderly defense into complete disaster. One frightened warrior could unintentionally condemn hundreds of others. Because of this, commanders punished cowardice harshly. A samurai who fled the battlefield without permission risked losing his lands, his position, and his family's reputation. In particularly serious cases, he could be ordered to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, as a final opportunity to reclaim a measure of honor through death. It was a grim reminder that in feudal Japan, surviving dishonor was sometimes considered worse than dying with dignity. Yet the judgment of cowardice was not always simple. Experienced commanders occasionally ordered strategic withdrawals to preserve their forces. Retreating under orders required discipline and courage of its own. The disgrace came not from falling back, but from placing personal survival above duty. Ironically, some of the greatest threats to a samurai's honor did not occur on the battlefield at all. They happened during times of peace, when no swords were drawn, and temptation quietly whispered from within, rather than charging from across the field. Not every crime that ruined a samurai involved swords, battlefields, or dramatic betrayals. Some began much more quietly, with a purse of silver slipped beneath a table, a missing sack of rice, or a tax record that somehow failed to match reality. While courage often defined a samurai's public reputation, honesty determined whether he deserved the trust that came with his position. A warrior who could not be trusted with responsibility soon discovered that honor disappeared just as quickly in an office as it did on a battlefield. Contrary to popular imagination, many samurai spent far more time managing paperwork than fighting enemies. During the long peace of the Tokugawa period, which lasted for more than 2 centuries, relatively few warriors ever experienced major battles. Instead, they became administrators, magistrates, castle officials, tax collectors, police officers, and judges. Their swords still hung proudly at their sides, but many of their daily battles involved documents rather than duels. These positions gave them considerable authority. A magistrate settled disputes between merchants. A tax official calculated how much rice villages owed their daimyo. Castle administrators supervised warehouses filled with valuable supplies, while other officials distributed stipends to fellow samurai. With so much wealth passing through their hands, opportunities for corruption were never far away. Accepting bribes ranked among the most serious offences. Imagine two merchants arguing over ownership of valuable land. If one secretly paid the judge to rule in his favour, justice disappeared before the hearing had even begun. Such behaviour damaged more than the individuals involved. It weakened confidence in the entire government. A lord who could not trust his own officials soon found it difficult to trust anyone at all. Stealing from one's lord was even worse. Rice was the foundation of Japan's economy, functioning almost like currency. Samurai were often paid in rice stipends, taxes were collected in rice, and entire domains measured wealth by how much rice they produced. Skimming a few sacks from government warehouses might seem insignificant at first glance, but repeated often enough, it became theft on a remarkable scale. It was rather like quietly helping yourself to a small piece of the kingdom every week and hoping nobody noticed. Eventually, somebody always did. Punishments varied according to the crime and the status of the offender. Lesser officials could lose their position, property, or family privileges. More serious offenders faced imprisonment, execution, or orders to commit seppuku. A lifetime spent building a respectable name could vanish because of one dishonest decision made in a moment of greed. For a samurai, the greatest irony was that many of these crimes happened during peaceful times. When there were no wars to fight, the real test of character often came from resisting temptation, and among all temptations, few proved more dangerous than allowing personal ambition to outweigh loyalty itself. For a samurai, honour was never something he carried alone. Every decision he made reflected not only upon himself, but upon his parents, his ancestors, his children, and even generations yet to be born. His family name was a living inheritance, carefully built over decades or even centuries through loyal service, military courage, and faithful conduct. To disgrace that name was considered one of the cruelest things a samurai could do, not because it wounded his pride, but because it punished people who had committed no crime at all. Family reputation was everything in feudal Japan. Noble households carefully preserved records of their ancestors, celebrating victories, loyal service, and important appointments. A respected family gained opportunities. Their sons found better positions, advantageous marriages became possible, and powerful lords viewed them as trustworthy retainers. Reputation functioned almost like invisible wealth, passed down from one generation to the next. The opposite was equally true. If a samurai became known for dishonesty, cowardice, drunken violence, or betrayal, that stain did not disappear with his death. His descendants often carried the burden long afterward. Other clans hesitated to marry into the family. Lords questioned whether loyalty truly ran in their blood. Even innocent children could spend years trying to repair damage caused by one reckless ancestor. Because of this, samurai were expected to conduct themselves properly, not only in public but also in private. Excessive gambling, constant drunkenness, uncontrolled anger, or abusing those beneath them reflected poorly on the entire household. A warrior was expected to demonstrate discipline at all times. Losing control of one's behaviour suggested that the discipline learned through years of training had accomplished very little. Marriage carried similar expectations. Families often arranged marriages to strengthen alliances between important households. A scandal involving adultery or public misconduct threatened far more than one unhappy relationship. It could damage political alliances, create feuds between powerful clans, and embarrass everyone connected to both families. Personal choices rarely remained personal for very long. Financial irresponsibility could also bring disgrace. Some samurai, particularly during the peaceful Tokugawa era, struggled with debt. Their incomes remained fixed while expenses continued to rise. Maintaining fine clothing, respectable residences, servants, weapons, and proper appearances became increasingly expensive. A few borrowed far beyond their means, hoping better fortunes would eventually arrive. Unfortunately, creditors possessed an irritating habit of expecting repayment regardless of a warrior's noble ancestry. Even something as simple as failing to educate one's children properly reflected badly upon the head of the household. Sons were expected to inherit not only swords, but values. If they grew into dishonest or undisciplined adults, many believed the father had failed long before the son ever made his first mistake. In the samurai world, honor resembled a carefully polished mirror. It took years of patience to keep it shining, yet only one careless crack could leave damage that echoed through an entire family for generations. And for some warriors, the greatest disgrace came not from their own failures, but from turning their swords against those they had once sworn to protect. A samurai carried two swords almost everywhere he went. Together they symbolized his rank, his authority, and his duty. But those swords came with an expectation that was just as important as knowing how to use them, knowing when not to. Contrary to popular legends, a samurai could not simply cut down anyone who irritated him. Doing so without proper justification could cost him everything he had spent a lifetime earning. In feudal Japan, violence was governed by surprisingly strict rules. Samurai occupied the warrior class, but they were also expected to serve as examples of discipline. Drawing a blade in anger was not considered proof of strength. More often, it suggested a dangerous lack of self-control. A warrior who reached for his sword every time he was insulted would soon find himself without many neighbours and, quite possibly, without his position. This became especially important during the long peace established by the Tokugawa shogunate. For more than 2 centuries, large-scale warfare became relatively rare. Castle towns flourished, merchants grew wealthy, and daily life became far more orderly than during the centuries of civil war. Samurai now walked crowded streets alongside craftsmen, farmers, monks, and traders. A careless sword swing in a busy marketplace could create chaos far beyond a personal dispute. One famous privilege often misunderstood today was kirisut gomen, sometimes translated as the right to cut down. Under very specific circumstances, a samurai could strike someone who had seriously insulted or attacked him. However, this was not a license to kill over minor disagreements. The samurai was expected to prove that the offence had been severe enough to justify deadly force. Witnesses might be questioned, officials investigated the incident, and an unjustified killing could bring harsh punishment instead of praise. Imagine explaining that you ended a man's life because he bumped into your shoulder while carrying vegetables through a crowded street. Even many officials of the time would have found that explanation rather unconvincing. Killing another samurai without lawful cause carried even greater consequences. Such an act threatened the fragile balance between powerful families and could ignite feuds lasting generations. Depending on the circumstances, the offender might lose his lands, be imprisoned, executed, or ordered to commit seppuku to preserve what little honour remained. Even if he believed himself justified, convincing the authorities was another matter entirely. A samurai was expected to master his emotions before mastering his sword. Patience, restraint, and careful judgment separated a respected warrior from a reckless thug carrying expensive weapons. Anyone could lose their temper. A true samurai was expected to control it. Ironically, however, even perfect self-control could not protect a warrior from the greatest danger of all. Sometimes the crime that destroyed a samurai was not committed with anger or greed, but with a single decision to place his own life above the honor he had sworn to defend. For all the crimes a samurai feared, there was one punishment that haunted nearly every warrior more than imprisonment or even death. It was the loss of status. To be stripped of the right to call yourself a samurai was to lose your identity, your livelihood, your family honor, and your place in society all at once. In feudal Japan, this was not simply a professional setback. It was the complete destruction of the life you had been born to live. Being a samurai was not merely an occupation, it was a legal class. Samurai alone enjoyed privileges that separated them from the rest of society. They had the right to carry the daisho, the paired long and short swords that symbolized their rank. They received stipends from their lord, wore distinctive clothing, and occupied positions of authority as military officers, administrators, and government officials. These privileges came with heavy responsibilities, but they also defined who a samurai was. When a warrior committed a serious offence, his lord could remove those privileges entirely. The confiscation of land was often the first blow. Many samurai relied on rice stipends or estates granted by their daimyo. Without them, supporting a household became almost impossible. Servants had to be dismissed, horses sold, armour pawned, and family possessions gradually disappeared. A house that had stood proudly for generations could fall into poverty within a few years. Then came the loss of rank. A disgraced samurai might be dismissed from his lord's service, becoming what the Japanese called a ronin, a masterless samurai. Not every ronin had committed a crime. Some lost their lords through war, political upheaval, or natural death. But for those expelled because of disgrace, life became especially difficult. Other daimyo hesitated to employ someone whose previous master had judged unworthy. Reputation travelled quickly across Japan's castle towns, and few employers wanted to gamble on a man already marked by scandal. Without steady income, many ronin struggled to survive. Some became teachers of swordsmanship or military strategy. Others worked as bodyguards, scribes, or instructors. A few drifted into gambling, crime, or mercenary work simply to put food on the table. The fall could be astonishingly swift. A man who once advised governors might soon find himself selling family heirlooms just to afford his next meal. The psychological burden was often even greater than the financial one. Imagine spending your entire childhood being told that your purpose was to serve your lord with honour, only to wake one morning and discover that title had been taken away forever. The swords at your waist remained the same pieces of steel, but they no longer carried the same meaning. For many samurai, that unbearable loss of identity explains why some chose another path entirely. Rather than live with permanent disgrace, they accepted one final duty, one that they believed could restore the honour that everything else had stripped away. The next chapter explores that solemn and deeply misunderstood ritual. For many people today, the idea seems almost impossible to understand. Why would someone willingly choose death instead of continuing to live? Yet for countless samurai, the answer was rooted in a lifetime of values that placed honour above everything else. When disgrace became unavoidable, seppuku, ritual suicide, was often viewed not as surrender, but as the final opportunity to preserve dignity. Contrary to popular imagination, seppuku was not performed casually or for every mistake. It was reserved for serious situations. A samurai who had betrayed his lord, failed catastrophically in battle, committed a grave offence, or faced unavoidable disgrace might be ordered to perform it by his daimyo. In other cases, a warrior chose it voluntarily, believing death preferable to living in permanent shame. The ritual itself followed strict traditions that had developed over centuries. It was not a spontaneous act carried out in anger or despair. It was a formal ceremony that reflected discipline even in one's final moments. The samurai first bathed and dressed in clean white robes, the colour associated with purity. He often composed a final death poem, expressing his thoughts in calm, elegant language. These poems rarely spoke of fear. Instead, they reflected on nature, the passing seasons, or the fleeting nature of life itself. Even at the edge of death, a warrior was expected to demonstrate composure and refinement. Witnesses gathered quietly as the ceremony began. A trusted companion, known as the Kaishakunin, stood nearby with a drawn sword. His role was both difficult and deeply honourable. After the samurai made the initial wound to his abdomen, the companion delivered a swift strike to end his suffering as quickly as possible. This required extraordinary skill. Too soon, and the ritual lost its meaning. Too late, and unnecessary agony followed. It was one of the heaviest responsibilities another samurai could accept. Modern stories often present seppuku as something every samurai eagerly embraced. Reality was far more complicated. No amount of training completely erased the natural fear of death. These were human beings with families, ambitions, friendships, and dreams. Many undoubtedly dreaded the moment. What distinguished them was not the absence of fear, but the belief that fulfilling one's duty outweighed personal survival. Not every disgraced samurai was granted the privilege of seppuku. That is an important detail often overlooked. Common criminals were usually executed in far less honourable ways. Being ordered to commit seppuku was, paradoxically, considered a sign that the authorities still recognised the samurai's status and believed he deserved an opportunity to reclaim his honour through a dignified death. Ancient Greece was not one united country. It was a patchwork of independent city-states, each proud of its own traditions, laws, and ambitions. Athens competed with Sparta. Corinth sought influence through trade. Thebes guarded its own interests. Smaller cities constantly shifted between alliances and rivalries, while wars erupted often enough that many Greeks grew up expecting conflict as a normal part of life. Yet several times each year, something extraordinary happened. The fighting stopped. Not forever, of course. Ancient politicians were no more capable of resisting arguments than modern ones. But during the greatest religious festivals, a sacred truce known as the Ekecheiria was declared. This agreement allowed travellers to cross the Greek world safely on their way to the sanctuaries of the gods. Even bitter enemies understood that interfering with pilgrims was not merely an insult to another city. It was considered an offence against the gods themselves. As news of the truce spread, roads that had recently carried marching soldiers began filling with very different travellers. Athletes walked beside philosophers. Farmers travelled alongside wealthy merchants. Priests, musicians, poets, craftsmen, and entire families packed their belongings and set out on journeys that sometimes lasted several days, or even weeks. Donkeys carried supplies, wagons rattled along dusty tracks, and ships crossed the Aegean Sea packed with passengers eager to reach the celebrations. The closer they came to the great sanctuaries, the busier the roads became. Travellers exchanged stories around evening campfires, debated politics, argued over whose city produced the finest athletes, and shared food beneath the stars. It was one of the few occasions when people from every corner of the Greek world gathered peacefully in the same place. If someone claimed Sparta had the best warriors while an Athenian insisted intelligence mattered more than muscles, the discussion probably lasted well into the night. Some debates, it seems, never truly disappear. Upon arriving, visitors encountered scenes unlike anything they experienced back home. Temporary markets stretched along the roads leading to the sanctuaries. Merchants sold pottery, jewellery, olive oil, wine, perfumes, and beautifully crafted bronze objects. Musicians entertained passing crowds while storytellers recited famous myths. Inns overflowed with guests, tents covered nearby fields, and the sound of countless conversations filled the air from sunrise until long after sunset. These festivals were far more than holidays. They united a civilization that otherwise spent much of its time divided. For a few precious days, people stopped thinking of themselves primarily as Athenians, Spartans, Corinthians, or Argives. Instead, they remembered that despite their rivalries, they shared the same language, worshipped many of the same gods, and belonged to the wider Greek world. And before the games could begin, before actors stepped onto the stage or musicians lifted their instruments, every celebration started with the most important purpose of all: honouring the gods who had made this remarkable gathering possible. Long before the first wrestler entered the arena, before the opening notes of a musician echoed across the hills, and before actors stepped onto the stage wearing towering masks, the ancient Greeks gathered for a far more important reason. Every great festival began as an act of worship. The competitions, feasts and celebrations were magnificent, but they all existed to honour the gods. Without the religious ceremonies, there would have been no festival at all. As dawn broke over the sacred sanctuaries, priests prepared the temples for the day's rituals. Fresh flowers decorated altars, incense drifted into the cool morning air, and attendants swept the stone courtyards where thousands of visitors would soon gather. The towering temples themselves seemed to glow beneath the rising sun, their marble columns catching the first light while pilgrims quietly assembled outside. People arrived carrying offerings from every corner of Greece. Some brought baskets filled with fruit, fresh bread, jars of honey, olive oil, or fine wine. Wealthier visitors sometimes donated beautifully crafted bronze tripods, silver bowls, or elaborately painted pottery. Even those with very little tried to bring something. The value of an offering was measured not only by its cost, but by the respect it demonstrated toward the gods. Soon the religious procession began. Priests led the way wearing ceremonial robes, followed by magistrates, musicians playing the haunting melodies of the aulos, young women carrying sacred baskets, and citizens holding branches of olive or laurel. Behind them came hundreds, sometimes thousands, of ordinary pilgrims. The entire procession moved slowly toward the temple while hymns filled the air. Imagine an entire city walking together in complete purpose, except with considerably fewer mobile phones interrupting the atmosphere. At the centre of many ceremonies stood the animal sacrifice, a practice that may seem unfamiliar or uncomfortable to modern audiences, but was one of the most sacred acts in Greek religion. Carefully selected cattle, sheep, goats or pigs were washed, decorated with ribbons, and led to the altar. Before the sacrifice, prayers were offered, asking the gods for protection, prosperity, victory, or good harvests. Afterward, the animal was prepared according to strict religious customs. Certain portions, particularly the thigh bones wrapped in fat, were burned as offerings to the gods. The remaining meat was cooked and shared among the participants. This transformed the ceremony into a communal feast, where worshippers believed they were symbolically dining in the presence of the deity they honoured. For many ordinary Greeks, these festivals also provided one of the few opportunities to enjoy generous portions of meat. The sanctuaries themselves became living museums of gratitude. Victorious generals dedicated captured weapons. Successful athletes left statues of themselves. Cities donated magnificent treasuries filled with gifts honouring Zeus, Apollo, Athena, or Dionysus. Every offering told a story of thanksgiving, hope, or ambition. Only after the sacrifices were complete, the prayers spoken, and the gods properly honoured, could the celebrations truly begin. Now, with divine favour hopefully secured, the crowds turned toward the contests that would make these festivals legendary throughout the Greek world. With the sacrifices complete and the blessings of Zeus respectfully requested, attention shifted toward the event that would become the most famous athletic festival in human history. Every 4 years, thousands of Greeks made the journey to Olympia, a peaceful sanctuary in the western Peloponnese. For a few remarkable days, the greatest athletes from across the Greek world gathered to compete, not for riches, but for something they often valued even more: everlasting glory. The sanctuary itself buzzed with excitement long before the competitions began. Tents covered the surrounding fields, merchants opened busy stalls, philosophers debated beneath the shade of olive trees, and spectators searched for the best places to watch the events. Visitors from Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and dozens of smaller cities stood shoulder to shoulder. Many of these people might normally have viewed one another with suspicion. Here, however, they shared the same anticipation as they waited to witness extraordinary displays of human strength and skill. Not just anyone could compete. Athletes trained for years before earning the chance to appear at Olympia. They also had to prove they were free Greek men and swear an oath before the statue of Zeus that they would compete honestly. Cheating was considered both disgraceful and sacrilegious. Anyone caught bribing opponents or breaking the rules faced heavy fines and lasting embarrassment. Ancient Greece may not have had instant replay, but it certainly had strong opinions about fair play. The games began with foot races, the oldest Olympic event. Runners exploded down the stadium track barefoot, sprinting over packed earth while thousands of spectators shouted encouragement. Victory often came down to the smallest margin imaginable. There were no electronic timers or photo finishes. The judges simply watched with experienced eyes, hoping no one crossed the line while simultaneously arguing about it. Combat sports followed. Wrestling demanded strength, balance, and technique. Boxing was considerably more brutal than its modern counterpart. Fighters wrapped hardened leather straps around their hands, but wore no protective gloves or headgear. Broken noses, swollen eyes, and missing teeth were accepted as unfortunate but perfectly ordinary souvenirs. Then came the pancration, perhaps the most feared event of all. It combined wrestling and boxing into a contest where almost anything was permitted except biting and gouging the eyes. Competitors threw, struck, locked joints, and fought until one man admitted defeat or became unable to continue. It was an astonishing display of endurance that made even experienced spectators wince. The phrase "friendly sporting event" had clearly not yet been invented. Elsewhere, horses thundered around the hippodrome, pulling chariots at breathtaking speed. Wealthy aristocrats often sponsored these teams, since maintaining racing horses required enormous expense. Chariot races thrilled the crowds, but were also incredibly dangerous. Crashes sent splintered wood, frightened horses, and drivers tumbling across the track. Winning brought immense prestige. Simply finishing sometimes felt like an impressive achievement, and after days of competition, only one prize awaited each champion, a simple wreath woven from wild olive branches. No gold, no silver, no treasure chest overflowing with coins. Yet when those victorious athletes returned home, entire cities welcomed them as heroes. Some received free meals for life, generous rewards, statues, and songs celebrating their names. The olive wreath itself cost almost nothing, but the honour it represented was priceless. When the cheers of the Olympic crowds faded into memory, another great festival revealed a very different side of ancient Greece. At Delphi, nestled high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, victory was not measured only by speed, strength, or endurance. Here, during the Pythian Games, beauty itself became a competition. Music echoed through the sacred valley, poets recited verses, singers performed before enormous audiences, and artists competed for glory beneath the watchful gaze of Apollo, the god of music, poetry, and prophecy. Delphi already held a special place in the Greek imagination. Pilgrims travelled from every corner of the Mediterranean to consult the famous oracle of Apollo, seeking advice before wars, colonization, marriages, and political decisions. Kings, generals, merchants, and ordinary farmers all climbed the winding mountain roads, hoping the god might offer guidance. During the Pythian festival, however, the sanctuary transformed into something even more remarkable. Alongside priests and pilgrims came musicians carrying delicate instruments, choruses rehearsing harmonies, and poets quietly repeating their lines before stepping into the spotlight. The festival's musical competitions were among the most prestigious in Greece. Contestants performed on the kithara, a large professional lyre associated with Apollo himself. Unlike the smaller lyre commonly played at home, the kithara demanded years of practice to master. Its rich sound filled open courtyards, carrying across the sanctuary as audiences listened in respectful silence. Every note mattered. One poorly played passage could separate a forgotten performer from a future champion. The haunting sound of the aulos also filled the air. This double reed instrument, often played with two pipes at once, produced a powerful, emotional tone, unlike anything heard in modern orchestras. Skilled musicians could make it sound joyful, mournful, or even unsettling depending on the occasion. If someone unfamiliar with ancient Greek music suddenly heard an aulos, they might wonder whether a snake was singing opera. The Greeks, however, considered it one of their finest instruments. Singers competed both as solo performers and in carefully rehearsed choirs. Their voices honoured Apollo through hymns that celebrated his victories, his wisdom, and his protection over Delphi. Judges listened closely, evaluating not only technical skill, but also emotion, pronunciation, rhythm, and devotion. Music was not merely entertainment. It was an offering to the gods, and excellence reflected respect as much as talent. Poets stood before the crowds to recite newly composed works, while storytellers brought familiar myths to life through dramatic performances. Many Greeks learned the legends of Heracles, Perseus, Jason, and the Trojan War, not by reading books, but by hearing gifted performers recite them aloud. In a world where literacy was far from universal, memory became an extraordinary art form. A talented poet could hold thousands of listeners completely silent using nothing more than his voice. The Pythian Games reminded every visitor that greatness came in many forms. Some heroes earned glory with powerful arms and swift feet. Others achieved immortality through melodies, poetry, and stories that continued echoing long after the final note had faded into the mountain air. And nowhere would storytelling become more powerful than in the grand theatres of Athens, where entire cities gathered to laugh, weep, and watch the greatest dramas ever written. If the Pythian Games celebrated the beauty of music, then Athens transformed storytelling into one of the greatest public spectacles of the ancient world. Every spring, during the city Dionysia, thousands of people climbed the southern slope of the Acropolis and took their seats in one of history's most remarkable theatres. They had not gathered simply to be entertained. They had come to witness performances that explored war, justice, family, love, revenge, politics, and the complicated nature of being human. For several unforgettable days, the entire city became an audience. The festival honoured Dionysus, the god of wine, celebration, fertility, and theatre itself. Like every major Greek festival, it began with religious ceremonies. Priests led processions through Athens, carrying sacred statues and offering sacrifices before the dramatic competitions officially opened. Only after the gods had received proper respect did the actors take the stage. The theatre of Dionysus was unlike any building most people had ever seen. Carved into the hillside beneath the Acropolis, it could accommodate thousands of spectators. Citizens, visiting foreigners, ambassadors, and honoured guests filled the stone seats from sunrise until evening. Looking across the audience, you could see nearly every layer of Athenian society gathered in one place. It was one of the few occasions when politics, religion, art, and public life blended into a single extraordinary event. The plays themselves were competitions. Several playwrights presented groups of tragedies, hoping judges would declare their work the finest of the festival. Winning brought enormous prestige. Names such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides became famous throughout the Greek world because of these performances. Their stories continue to be staged today, a rather impressive achievement considering most of us struggle to remember what happened in last week's television series. Tragedies tackled difficult questions rather than offering simple answers. Kings destroyed themselves through pride. Heroes discovered that courage alone could not escape fate. Families were torn apart by revenge, while ordinary people struggled against the will of powerful gods. The audience laughed very little during these performances, but they thought deeply. Many Athenians believed great tragedy helped people examine their own lives and understand both human weakness and human greatness. Fortunately, not every performance required emotional devastation before lunchtime. After the tragedies came comedies, and the atmosphere changed completely. Playwrights such as Aristophanes delighted audiences with sharp political satire, ridiculous situations, exaggerated characters, and jokes aimed at some of Athens' most powerful citizens. Politicians, philosophers, military leaders, and even the public itself became targets. Imagine attending a national festival where your country's leaders were openly mocked before thousands of laughing spectators. Ancient Athenians considered that perfectly acceptable, provided the jokes were clever enough. Actors wore elaborate masks that allowed a small cast to portray many different characters. These masks featured exaggerated expressions, so even spectators sitting high above the stage could recognize whether a character was joyful, furious, terrified, or heartbroken. Combined with colourful costumes and powerful voices, they transformed simple performances into unforgettable experiences. By the festival's end, the winners earned lasting fame, but the audience carried home something even more valuable, stories that would be discussed for generations. Yet the celebrations did not end when the curtain fell. Outside the theatres, entire cities continued feasting, dancing, trading, and celebrating together in ways that made these festivals feel like the beating heart of the Greek world. When the final actors left the stage, and the last victorious athlete received his crown, the festival was far from over. In fact, for many ordinary Greeks, this was when the celebration truly came alive. Streets filled with laughter, marketplaces remained crowded long after sunset, musicians played without pause, and families gathered around tables overflowing with food. The sacred ceremonies had honoured the gods, the competitions had crowned their champions, and now it was time for people themselves to celebrate. Every major festival transformed its host city into something resembling a giant open-air gathering. Temporary markets appeared almost overnight. Merchants arrived from every corner of the Greek world, carrying goods that many visitors had never seen before. Pottery from Corinth, fine olive oil from Attica, colourful textiles from Ionia, perfumes from the Eastern Mediterranean, bronze weapons, jewellery, carved statues, and exotic spices all competed for attention. Walking through these bustling streets was like visiting every Greek city at once without ever leaving the sanctuary. For traders, festivals were wonderful business opportunities. Thousands of visitors meant thousands of customers. Agreements were negotiated over cups of wine, craftsmen displayed their finest work, and travellers often returned home carrying gifts and souvenirs that reminded them of their journey. The gods may have inspired the gathering, but merchants certainly appreciated the crowds as well. Even in antiquity, someone always managed to discover that religious devotion and successful sales could comfortably coexist. Food became another centerpiece of the celebrations. Public feasts often followed religious sacrifices, allowing entire communities to share meals together. Long wooden tables filled with roasted meat, fresh bread, olives, cheese, figs, grapes, onions, fish, nuts, and honey cakes stretched across open courtyards. Wine flowed generously, although it was almost always mixed with water before drinking. Consuming unmixed wine was generally considered uncivilized behavior. The Greeks admired moderation, even if some festival guests occasionally interpreted moderation rather creatively by the end of the evening. Music rarely stopped for long. The gentle sound of lyres mixed with the lively melodies of the aulos, while singers entertained crowds gathered beneath colonnades and shaded courtyards. Soon dancing began. Greek dances varied from region to region, but many involved groups moving together in carefully practiced circles or lines. Men and women often danced separately depending on the occasion, while certain dances celebrated military victories, harvests, marriages, or religious devotion. Others were simply joyful expressions of community. Children eagerly copied the adults. Older generations offered advice that nobody had requested, and enthusiastic participants occasionally displayed far more confidence than rhythm. Some traditions appear to be wonderfully timeless. As darkness settled over the sanctuary, thousands of oil lamps illuminated temples, streets, and gathering places. Conversations continued deep into the night. Friends reunited after years apart. Philosophers debated difficult questions. Poets recited new verses. And strangers from distant cities discovered they shared far more than they had imagined. For a brief moment, political rivalries seemed less important than the simple pleasure of celebrating together. These festivals achieved something remarkable. They brought together people who spent much of the rest of the year separated by mountains, seas, and competing loyalties. And nowhere was that shared Greek identity displayed more clearly than at the other great Pan-Hellenic festivals, where every victory became a triumph, celebrated far beyond the city in which it was won. By the time the celebrations at Olympia came to an end, many travellers were already thinking about the next great gathering. The Olympic Games may have become the most famous festival in history, but they were only one part of a much larger tradition. Across ancient Greece, 4 major Pan-Hellenic festivals united the Greek world: the Olympic Games at Olympia, the Pythian Games at Delphi, the Nemean Games at Nemea, and the Isthmian Games near Corinth. Together they formed a cycle of celebrations that filled the calendar and gave athletes, musicians, and entire cities countless opportunities to earn lasting fame. The Nemean Games took place in the sanctuary of Zeus at Nemea, surrounded by peaceful valleys and vineyards. According to Greek mythology, the festival honoured the infant Opheltes, whose tragic death became part of the region's legendary history. Like Olympia, the games featured foot races, wrestling, boxing, pancration, and chariot racing. Victors received a simple crown woven from wild celery, a prize that sounds rather unusual today. Modern athletes generally dream of gold medals rather than decorative vegetables, but for the Greeks, the honour behind the crown mattered far more than the plant itself. Farther east, near the narrow isthmus of Corinth, stood another bustling sanctuary dedicated to Poseidon, god of the sea. The Isthmian Games reflected Corinth's position as one of Greece's busiest commercial cities. Ships from across the Mediterranean arrived nearby, bringing merchants, sailors, diplomats, and travellers from distant lands. During festival time, the sanctuary became an extraordinary meeting place where athletic contests blended naturally with business, diplomacy, and celebration. Because Corinth connected northern and southern Greece, visitors found it relatively easy to reach. Roads overflowed with travellers, while harbours filled with vessels carrying competitors eager to test themselves against the finest athletes of the Greek world. The prizes here usually took the form of crowns made from pine branches, although the true reward remained exactly the same as everywhere else: reputation. Winning at all 4 Pan-Hellenic festivals was exceptionally rare.